I think one thing that gets overlooked in our society is that Congress does have the power to regulate the NCAA in college sports. I actually took sports law in law school about 20 years ago, and probably about a third of that class was all about how Congress regulates college sports through things like Title IX and a lot of the federal laws and, quite frankly, the federal Constitution. In this video, I'm going to talk about why I think Congress needs to step in to better regulate what's going on with the possible dissolution of conferences in college sports, namely in football. So I kind of wrote down some factoids and some statistics I'm going to share with you in the video to kind of prove my case that I think we need better regulation in this area, namely in things like football and basketball. You still need conferences. UCLA and USC should not be in the Big Ten. This could be the beginning of the end of conferences in college sports like football and basketball. One of the big things that caused this within the last few years is the Pac-12 conference could not get a TV rights deal. And that had a lot to do with USC and UCLA leaving the Pac-12 and the Pac-12 essentially dissolving by default because of this issue. I think Congress could have rectified this, and they should have stepped in to try to cut some kind of a deal with the TV networks so those Pac-12 games would have had adequate coverage and things like that. There could have been some kind of a compromise solution here. I think we still need that. The Pac-12 dissolution issue is still pending, and they're trying to bring new teams into the conference. I think it's going to spell disaster for college sports. I think to make it fair, you need conferences based on regions for college sports. That way you have some way to judge where these teams are at for the national title or for bowl game eligibility. Further back, Notre Dame, in my opinion, in football in the 80s and early 90s essentially tried to more or less rig their schedule in football because they weren't independent. I personally am not a big fan of the NCAA allowing independence in college sports. I think they should all be in conferences. What Notre Dame used to do in football in many of these years, if not all of them in the 80s and 90s, is they would kind of cherry pick the schedule to play these teams that they matched up well against from the Big Ten, the Midwest, or the West, or the South, so they could go undefeated every year. And it's not just them. There's many other schools that were doing it back then. Other independents were doing it if they existed. Even schools in conferences tried to do this type of stuff with the regular season and bowl games, namely in football. The media like Notre Dame. It's just one example. There's other schools that have done it. But it's a big problem when you have one big football power that's an independent back then or even now, and all these other people have to play in a conference and have to play really rough competition or something close to that every single week, year after year, over and over, especially in sports like football. I think if Congress doesn't better regulate this and step in and get some kind of control over the NCAA, what's going to happen is you're going to have more schools that are going to essentially have rigged schedules because they're going to keep bouncing conferences to play weaker teams. There's a reason why USC and UCLA want to be in the Big Ten, and in the long term are probably really going to like this because there's going to be Big Ten schools in football, namely in football, that are not going to be on their level, and in the long term they're probably going to blow a lot of those schools out in score. I also think you're going to have certain schools that are going to monopolize heavily at the top of college sports, namely in football. No conferences is going to equal schedule chaos. Congress needs to do something, and the NCAA needs to do something. You need to judge teams, especially in sports like football and basketball, by conferences. Without conferences, there's really no real objective way to really measure where these teams are really at in college sports. There's a reason why the conferences were created by zip code and region in the U.S. way back. Even further back, independence died out and almost everybody was in some sort of a conference when it came to college sports. Congress needs to stop the dissolution of the Pac-12. They need to make sure that these conferences stay intact. Otherwise, you're going to have intellectual chaos when it comes to judging these teams for the national title or bowl game eligibility. I even think the NCAA should make more of an effort to stop this. We need conferences in college sports. Once again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your consideration. It's free to subscribe.